I turn the floor and sharing over to Carlos, my friend.
Thank you, Anitra. Thank you so much for your kind words. I'm happy that maybe you haven't met enough engineers. I don't know. I think I'm not such an exception among engineers. But anyway, thank you for saying that. May I share my screen? Ryan, I need you to do something for me to share the screen. And
are you there, Ryan?
Yeah, it should be possible now.
Okay. Can you try sharing now?
That's actually the case.
Thank
you. So you should be seeing my screen now, right?
Yes, we do. We see your screen.
So thank you all, particularly Anitra, Ted, Ryan, David, for organizing these meetings. And I would like also particularly to thank the African people. We are all Africans, as you know, but some more than others. And a lot of what I will say comes from learning. Mampela did something very good when she chose the lemma of our annual conference in Cape Town in 2019. Was learning from Africa. So a lot of what I'm going to say comes from that. And if you see a coincidence between my title, Taking Leaps, with the name of the leap school system that John Gilmore created, it's not a coincidence. I realized it took me some time to realize the word is very appropriate for what I'm going to discuss and I'm going to provoke you with. Let's start with a bit of very simple matter on the tricks of perception. If I see a circle, it cannot be a square, right? That's pretty obvious. Well, not so obvious if what you have is a cylinder and you are looking at that from different perspectives. Very easy trick of an object which, depending on where you see it from, looks like a circle or a square. The same with this sign, you know, if you look at this, depending on where you look at it from, it's a 6, a 9, or something else, who knows? Just a soft introduction to the point that we don't have access to reality. We perceive, we have perceptions, we receive signals. Most of them, by the way, are unconscious. I mean, all of them, the signals, all of them are received in unconscious ways. And those perceptions are translated into certain understanding, a certain meaning through frameworks of interpretation. Those frameworks are usually unconscious. We are not thinking all the time about how we think, right? We just think and we just interpret what we see, what we perceive through all our senses. But it's very important to know this, that as much as we have frameworks of interpretation, we have blind spots. We have elements of those frameworks which make us not seeing certain things. And sometimes it's because we don't want to see them. And we don't know how many blind spots we have and if we will be ever able to know which blind spots we have, but at least we know we have blind spots. That makes a lot of a difference. Let's go to a slightly harder trick. How many apples do you see in this picture? And it seems there could be no trick here, right? Because whether you look at them from the top, from below, from the right, from the left, you continue seeing 3 apples, right? Well, if I show you the next slide, maybe your opinion will change. So we actually cannot count any number of apples, because you only can say here there are only 3 apples if you don't take time into account. And the potential evolution of those 3 apples into, if you wait enough and the conditions, the proper conditions are met, an infinite number of apples. So you have between 3 and infinite apples here in this picture. If you consider that apples are part of life, part of living beings, and as such, they can become something else. So the trick of counting is not so obvious. We take it as granted, you know, we take that as an obvious thing, but it's far from obvious. Even if we consider inanimated objects as like stones, if we introduce time dimension, and we cannot not introduce it, right? I mean, we are counting all the time as if time didn't exist, but it's always there and it's always working on. So stones with time can disappear and become particles of sand. So it's even with inanimated objects, it's even difficult to count, actually count how many of them there are. And if it's difficult to count, imagine about defining boundaries and answering who contains who. So of course, the tree contains the apples contain the seeds, but the seeds contain the trees as well. So where is the border between a seed, an apple, and a tree? Or what, is there a hierarchy? No, of course not. There is not a hierarchy. A tree contains a seed contains a tree. Where are the borders here? In this picture of a meadow, very much alive, as you can see, beautiful one. But where are the borders? Not easy to say, right? And I've given this introduction in the tricks of perception and how some of the concepts we use, we take for granted, are not so taken for granted, should not be so taken for granted. Also because I want to put a bit of light on what I consider is a big blind spot, which is our relationship to measurement and the anxiety of measurement. We had in a previous conversation, you know, we started talking about well-being, and immediately we went into how do we measure well-being? Oh, measurement is a much harder trick than what I've shown to you until now. And to make myself explain, this is an example of case where measuring is part of a relationship. Here you have a sailing boat with a steersman, and the relationship is between the steersman and the boat, the system with the steersman and the boat and the air and the winds. And in that case, well, you don't necessarily need a separate system of measurement. But of course, the steersman is measuring in his, if he's well experienced, is measuring it in his guts, I would say. Basically 2 things, the intensity and the direction of the winds. And he has established a relationship with the air so that the ship can travel, can go forward. So yes, measurement is many times necessary, but it's especially interesting when it is part of a relationship. And by the way, just because I am an aerospace engineer, we have another case of a modern artifact like a plane, where measuring continues to be part of a relationship. So much more sophisticated, of course. The plane is has a lot of systems and subsystems and all that, but the principle under which it works is exactly the same as the principle of the sailing boat. It's aerodynamic lift. And without that, without the air, so of course the plane needs also engines because it's not floating on water. But besides that, it's exactly the same kind of relationship. And it can be as difficult, as you know, for a plane as for, or more even more difficult for a plane than for a ship. So in many cases, our civilization has been able to use the potential of measurements to develop relationships, and interesting relationships, right? Like sailing or flying. But in other cases, one might ask, is measuring part of a relationship or part of an appropriation? This is the balance sheet of Apple, but it could be of any other corporation you would like, you know? So here again, measurements are the key element, but is this of the same nature of the measurements we were looking at, which were parts of relationships? Or is this about defining boundaries? While we know that in life, it's very difficult to draw boundaries, isn't this about defining boundaries and saying, this is mine and this is not mine, and my part is growing over time, and that's it? So I would say, beware of perceptions, as we saw. Beware of definitions, beware of borders, of measurements, and of conscious purpose. That's one I put it because Ndidi loves the sentence, beware of conscious purpose. But there are no clear borders, and hence there is no clear identity if we look at life. So a completely different thing, and we will come back to that, is the mental frameworks we use to organize our world and to think that we are, in a way, giving meaning to our world and having it controlled. But in nature, in life, and not even in sophisticated cases like the cases of the sailing boat or the plane, it's very difficult to define borders and hence to define identity. Moreover, important things are impossible to define. In the jargon of epistemology, they are called impredicative, meaning that you cannot define them without referring to themselves. Think about any kind of important things, things which are really important to you, you will see that you cannot define them. Define love, define life, define friendship, whatever. So my point, and this is of course a provocation, I'm not making a scientific statement, but we could elaborate on that, is that appropriation metrics, appropriation measurements, disconnect us from life and make wider our blind spots. And from that, it's easier for us to ignore the tragedies we create through the use of those appropriation metrics. A very important aspect of this is that what we have seen, particularly in the 2 last centuries, indicates that those metrics are not appropriate for describing life, but they've been very effective in creating the world we have. Because there are self-reinforcing mechanisms that exist. So for instance, privatization or rankings and many others, which make that the more appropriation works, the more it gets. And you have this kind of exponential process, which, well, in the end is destroying the whole world. So just as a question, do you use metrics and measurements to help relationships or to help appropriation? Not an easy, really not an easy question, because of course, everything is messed up, and again, borders are not easy to define. If we look at, I don't know, taxes, for instance, which are collected by governments, depending on what they use the taxes for, if they use them for health services and for education, you could say, well, these taxes, yes, that's appropriation, but they are used to keep alive relationships and societies and communities and provide well-being to people, which does not avoid that people generally perceive taxes as an appropriation. So I would say, to conclude on measurement, I would say, let's take care of what counts rather than count what we think can be counted. I've put some examples, very simple ones, and this could be, of course, developed much more, that we have been trained through mental frameworks to cheat our relationships with others, other human beings, with life and time, all of them with capital letters. And by doing that, we have been creating tragedies that our blind spots enable us to ignore. Maybe if we look into those blind spots in an honest way, we will find footprints for something else in the future. Just as an example, a quick one, you know, about so much is being said about energy transition and our need to get out of fossil fuels and all that. I would say, yes, of course. I mean, we have to get out of fossil fuels for sure. But is the question about changing our source of energy, is that the right question? Is that the appropriate one? Isn't that too narrow as a framework? If we keep in that, it's about let's shift to renewables. But if we still need a growing amount of energy per capita to ensure what we call well-being, we will be doomed anyway. So questioning this question, I think going in the direction of, instead of appropriation of relationships, might lead us to see that, well, it's not energy consumption itself which provides well-being. The driver of well-being, and that's well established by science, the driver of health and well-being is relationships and the quality of our relationships. So why don't we take that as a starting point of our reflection on how to get out of fossil fuels. In a way, what I'm saying is that we need to shift our epistemology, worldview, way of thinking, conceptual framework, whatever you call that. We are already out, but many people haven't realized that we are already out of modernity, as defined, you know, by the characteristics of the last 2 centuries, with man at the center, and I could have put white man at the center, in which we thought the world was empty. It never was empty. It was always full of life, of other people, of women. It was always full. But we took it as empty because it was convenient for our own selfish purposes. Modernity as a worldview based on separation, reductionism, and so on. While it's more than time to get to new worldviews, I call it the 5th element. I will come back to that later, where interdependencies are at the core. Relationships are crucial. We have blind spots, but we have also creativity and a capacity to learn. And last but not least, we still live in a framework where we take individual supremacy as the meaning of liberation, but it's actually also the way through which oppression and self-oppression happens, while we should realize that liberation comes from relationships. Our relationships, if we don't cheat them, are those who free us. Nothing of this is new at all. I'm not launching now a new concept, worldwide launch of something new. No, sorry. This has been there for decades, in some cases for centuries, in some cases for thousands of years in some others. Particularly the hypothesis about rationality, when we are emotional beings and we cannot separate rationality, conscious thinking from emotions, have been there, that has been there for thousands of years. So if we know all that, and we are in an organization which is credited and well known for raising the alarms 50 years ago with the limits to growth, etc. So the question is, why don't we learn what we already know? What is the big gap between knowledge, some kind of conscious understanding, and learning? As real learning is when you change patterns, you change your way of being as a consequence of what you know, but we don't, right? This might have some relationship with power and how power is distributed, is created and distributed. And I just wanted to have these two quotes from two very different persons to illustrate a little bit I've chosen them with a very deliberate intention, because Karl Deutsch was a Czech social scientist who migrated to the USA, worked at MIT, more or less at the same time the limits to growth was developed, the thinking and the report. And he was close, he never became a member of the Club of Rome, but he was pretty close to that thinking and was inspired by the limits to growth. And it said something which, since the first time I read that, is shocking me. Power is the ability not to have to learn anything. So power as opposed to learning, interesting. And Chimamanda Adichie is a Nigerian writer, an artist, a creator, a young woman from Africa, saying in a recording which came to my mind very recently, that power is the ability to tell the story of another person and make it the definitive one. So yeah, learning and stories might have a relationship with power. This is very much the way we are framing, together with Mampela, Nora Bateson, and Didi, Noli Edosian, and some others, how we are framing the Emerging New Civilizations Initiative as a big exercise in learning new ways of becoming human. And we have created a program that we call the Fifth Element, Life for Learning, Learning for Life, which is about how do we liberate the potential of learning for collective action. And I'm very much excited by the following possibility, which is, could we imagine creating spaces for learning based on the combination of three elements? Ancient wisdom coming from Africa, Asia, Latin America, indigenous cultures all around the world. Life-inspired science, that's not the whole of modern science, but there are significant pieces here and there who can be used, and the needs and the views of the disempowered, because those will be the people, I think, who will be more open to learn. And much more is at stake for them than for the people in power. And this is the program I call Taking Leaps in Sense Making from most of the world. What if we imagine places of learning for leaders, African leaders, to start thinking from an African lens, coherent with their own traditions and ancient wisdom, but also profiting from modern science to imagine a future for their countries and their people different from the one of modernity, which is getting us into self-destruction. And I'm done, but I cannot help putting this picture, you know, of a little girl going through a looking glass, because I think this is a perfect graphic metaphor for where we are. While we stay on this side of the looking glass, we are looking at ourselves. So in a way, we are looking back to the past, to the frameworks of modernity, which is preventing us from liberating the potential of learning. And when Alice goes through the looking glass, all kinds of crazy things start to happen, but also a whole world of possibilities opens. And we have to take this opportunity to create different futures. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carlos. This was extremely inspiring. And maybe we can take that down and look at one another, because I think that's more helpful than looking at Alice going through the looking glass. It's very interesting because I see the voyage standing on the deck of a ship, looking into the fog of the ocean and going forward, not in a living room with some middle class or upper class accoutrement, and looking back into this dim mirror piece of silicon glass, but I see us actually plunging into the depths of the ocean with this exploration. So perhaps that's a difference. And Dee Dee has made several lovely remarks. Would you like to be the first discussant? And I ask you to ask your questions of Carlos in about a half a minute or 3/4 of a minute, and Carlos to respond in about 3 minutes. So each one of us gets some chance to chat. And then I'm going to ask Mampela to unmute herself and be the following discussant. Go ahead, Ndidi. By the way, it's 110th anniversary of International Women's Day, so rejoice.
Yep.
We rejoice, we rejoice. I know Carlos is a really super smart reader, so I've actually written it all down, so I'm not taking up much time. He knows my brain sometimes more than I know myself, so I'm not going to ask a question. It's all there. Carlos, please respond.
That's the fog I'm talking about.
Yeah, you wrote a lot, actually.
Okay, so you want me to ask? Okay.
Yeah,
so
yeah. Maybe formulate your question. Yeah, go ahead, Ndidi.
Okay, okay. So I suppose the first thing is just thank you. The second is just my usual question: balance. The balance between, you know, what people count, which is really what the mainstream is at the moment, and how to bring into that paradigm what really counts, which is the question that you asked. And Chimamanda, just one minute. I'm multitasking today. My kids are 24 and 22, and I have my little niece here, and I'm remembering what it's like to have darling little darlings. Okay, and by the way, she counted 1 million apples. So Jimmy, I just have to ask this question and then I'm good. So I was really thrown by that power as opposed to learning. See, everybody's waving at you. And my question really was the question of mainstreaming. Just like, you know, I'm always saying, well, we need to include what counts in what people are counting. And the question for me is how. But I know that that's a challenge. Jimmy, you're going to have to wait. The other big question is mainstreaming. My question to you, Carlos, because we're kind of operating on the fringes, and somehow the fringes give us the freedom to create and not be constrained by many things. But to really move change, we need to mainstream. But maybe we don't. Maybe that's an illusion that I have, because I'm constantly pushing to take what counts into what is counted.
You muted. You muted.
My niece muted me. I'm sorry. I haven't
So,
seen
okay.
her in about a year. So
No,
this
no,
is
okay,
like,
okay.
so,
That's I got it. Lydia, I will
you
answer.
got it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, so it looks like you know, the mountain is very high because we are saying, look, it's about shifting the way we think while we still think that way, and while institutions and everything in the world is organized, you know, to keep us in this scheme of modernity. So it's even natural for each of us, you know, to even when I try to get out of the mental framework in which I am, if I forget about that particular effort, next second I will be in again. And this is this problem of we accept there is complexity, and we accept that complexity is relevant, and that living beings are complex and living societies are even more complex. A second later, we want the straightforward path to something else. The quick answer to your question is I don't have an answer. The more elaborated answer is that we shouldn't be anxious about mainstreaming. This is an iterative process, and as all innovations, and as far as we understand a little bit about innovation dynamics, it has to start in certain places with certain people, certain communities, and shift in those places. And a crucial issue is, how do we identify the mechanisms which enable those places to develop their own pathways, to learn their own pathways, and still, you know, and protect that from the whole weight of the incumbent way of thinking, and give them spaces to grow, and then reach a point in which this goes on naturally, this grows by itself. My take, and this is why I strongly say, let's try this in untypical places. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I think we have to do our best also to move the lines in Europe, in the USA, etc. But maybe it's in the other places where other traditions are still alive, other traditions which consider time and relationships as with a more central role, you know, to their way of thinking, and where the stakes are higher, as simple as that. So let's not run into trying to change the mindset of Coca-Cola, because what I've said would enter in conflict. I say Coca-Cola to say something, you know, but that would enter in conflict with the rules under which they operate, you know, and even if they wanted to be responsible, it would be very difficult for them to be so. Let's start elsewhere, and let's put a lot of attention on what are the conditions for that new learning to happen in spaces and to grow, and to reinforce itself and to grow. And to get the point where natural growth, organic growth is happening.
Mampello, would you like to add some wisdom to this discussion if you could unmute yourself?
Wisdom I can't add, but I can only thank Carlos for provoking us. The question in my mind is, how do we, as this network of networks of people engage with the rest of our fellow human beings to get them to the point where this power not to have to learn is exchanged for the power to learn how to tell theirs and other people's stories in a way that makes us better beings, because storytelling is what connects us. And the power not to learn is what separates us, because then you choose what you learn and what you don't learn. But I'm also taken by your point, Carlos, which is not the first time you raise this, that this leaping to make sense would be an important element of how my continent, for example, could start the journey of healing. Because part of why African governments are they're struggling so much, even the best of them who want to be better are struggling. And the reason is, it's like those apples. If you take them off the tree and stick them onto thorn bush, they're going to shrivel. And they won't be able to have those seeds that are going to bring about the next crop of apples. So what I think the world needs to, and by the world I mean us coming from different parts of the world, need to recognize the collective responsibility we have to find ways of igniting conversations about this leaping to make sense, which in the end can help free African leaders and leaders of other parts of the world with indigenous people to see the value of learning in the way Carlos put it, of starting with what's really innate to you, what is deep in your spirit, though that ancient wisdom that all of us have, because all of you are Africans. But if you are an African still in the 21st century and you are not rooted in that wisdom, it's very difficult to even learn the cybernetics and aerospace engineering, because you don't have the roots. You're like a tree that's kind of trying to grow with just this little bit of sand. And so for me, the challenge, particularly for the Club of Rome Africa region and its partners, is how do we find ways of building on what John Gilmore has done with his LEAP schools to make this into an approach for adults and young people and people who are not in school to leap into the sense making of rerouting themselves so that knowledge can have the meaning of learning how to live as an interconnected, interdependent being on a living earth.
Thank you, Mampela. Carlos, would you like to respond to her? I'm sure you would, from that smile.
I'm tempted to pass it to John Gilmore. Actually,
Well, no,
because,
I have my own question for him.
No.
But chat box.
No. But I will respond. Honestly, I think nobody has tried. So as much as we see modernity with all its implications as such a huge rock, you know, that we cannot move in any way, modernity has also its history. So it was not there since the beginning of times, and it had a very successful history under the parameters of modernity, a very disastrous history for the losers of that period. But it has an history. So it's not, we shouldn't take for granted that it will be there forever. And the way to get out of it, I think, is not to try to reform a little bit modernity or create something as fluffy as post-modernity, is to try something else on the side. And I think there is place on the side right now. And this is what came out in the conversation we had in the last Club of Rome Africa meeting. Why don't we imagine educational institutions for African leaders? Because right now, what do? They go to places which have the reputation, right? And typically those are Western places built very much on the concept of modernity and very conservative, because educational systems are extremely conservative. So why don't we imagine creating, I was saying, I'm tempted to pass it to John Gilmore because he did exactly that at a certain level. Why don't we imagine a LEAP school system for African leaders in collaboration, where you build on something which has, as far as I know, never been tried, which is mixing parts of modern science with ancient traditions. As far as I know, that has not been done. So ancient traditions have been analyzed and looked at from academia, but as such, as a separate silo. While modern science has been proceeding with its own research, and the parts of modern science I'm talking about are generally not the mainstream parts. And if we look also at the geopolitics of the world, why not try out of the main area of modernity, so looking in other places, in collaboration with Asia particularly, why not imagine creating LEAP schools for the education of African leaders? It will not change the world in 2 days, in 2 weeks, or 2 years, but it has to be the seed of substantial change. If we don't get, many times also in our conversations, we discuss initiatives which we would like to bring to the ministers of the government or your country, or other countries. And we say, oh my God, but they will not get it, they will not understand, because they are thinking in the same way of modernity. If we can get them to be trained in different ways, or the next generation of leaders to be trained in different ways, the result might be different.
John, he's asked for you twice. I can't resist the speakers.
I'm completely in awe of this conversation, and I just want to put a little precursor into it. The reason I work with adolescents is that they're so open to possibility, you know, and the beauty of the moment you introduce them to the idea of the looking glass, if you like, or the idea of transcendence of some sort, they immediately understand it's probably going to be a subversive process. You don't have to explain it to them. So for me, when you're doing a paradigm shift, going from the one side of the looking glass to the other, so a certain amount of subversion has got to be done here, because you've got to operate bimodally. You've got to operate in the paradigm to shift the paradigm. And there's where our real thinking has to be, to tease out what that process could look like. And actually, it's going to look like people are in relationship with us, so that in those relationships, we shift together. It's not that we are on the other side of the looking glass. We're also tumbling down that horrible tunnel and finding ourselves in the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. And in some ways, people watching tonight, watching this event, would think they're in the Mad Hatter's Tea Party.
Maybe we are.
Yeah, and that's fine. It's a beautiful place to be once you can embrace it. But if it feels so foreign that it feels like the only place you want to go is to get back on the other side of the looking glass, you're unlikely ever to try that again. So I do think that this is the right way of looking at the problem. And I think that we should be aware of our own polarities of talking about modernity versus this other alternative, and not get caught in that. And the whole metaphor of a leap is you leap from somewhere, but you're not quite sure where you're going to land. And that's the looking glass metaphor as well. So it's the letting go of the control of knowing what I'm going to measure and how I'm going to be measured. That is implicit in the leap. So I'm very excited to be talking about this and sharing it and looking at the transition from the adolescent window, because it's a particular kind of window. And the person who went through the looking glass was young. The older people struggle with looking glasses. So we're going to have to look for more invitational metaphors to get them to get into the transcendence that some of the people like Ken Wilber talk about, the consciousness transcendence that allows them to see themselves liberating through the quality of the relationships.
So now we have three concepts of where we are. On a boat going into the fog, tumbling down the hole of the rabbit, and sitting at the Mad Tea Party. Perhaps if we could blend all of those together, that's really where we are. David Pollock has some interesting questions for Carlos, and John needs to look at his chat box.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Anitra. No, I'm just struggling to maybe press Carlos as far as your experience goes to make the most direct linkages with those of us who are really caught up in the fact that we are in relationship with what we understand to be a dying planet with immense suffering already going on and more to come, with how the thinking that you opened up with can make contributions towards overcoming that or to well-being at the appropriate time for more on the planet. You had referenced a specific example of saying maybe our current ways of thinking lead us to ask the wrong questions, and you gave the example of energy and saying we need to, saying maybe it's not converting to renewables, maybe it has to do with reducing our requirements altogether. And I sort of say to myself, yeah, makes perfect sense, but probably both of those things are useful. So I'm struggling for the linkage between the philosophical reflection and the world that I experience, and the struggle to make progress to reduce climate change and to reduce inequity. And I'm not sure if there's a number of things I'm missing to understand how the relevance of your remarks. I sense I'm missing something, some linkages, but I don't have them clear in my mind yet.
Well, again, I cannot claim I have an answer to that. And it's a very difficult moment because again and again we will face ourselves, we will face the situation in which we see what is happening. Basically, as you said, relationship with I wouldn't call it a dying planet. I would shift the perception. The species is committing suicide, which is quite different. And now there is a shift in perception. And you know what? COVID made it possible, or at least accelerated that shift of perception. And just to put you an example, of somebody who only thinks at a very global level. I agree with the comment that Ted made about the importance of looking local, and this is very much, but I will come back to that. But somebody who thinks only global is Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations. I heard him in an event in Lisbon 3 years and a half ago. He was saying, oh, you know, I mean, the last 30 years have been fantastic, a lot of progress, wealth creation, and a lot of scientific development, technological development, blah, 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 with only two collateral damage: climate change and the growth of inequality. That was literal in his discourse in 2017, end of 2017. Last December, at a talk at the Columbia University, he started saying, we are waging a war at nature and this is a suicide. So there is actually a shift in perception, even at that level, who is obviously very far from suffering himself anything of what we are talking about. And I think I see this shift of perception, for instance, in how some people are starting to talk about international cooperation in a country like Switzerland. And so part of what I think we have to do is, so this shift of, instead of focusing on going from fossil fuels to renewables, going to the other question, which is, no, what we need is relationships, quality relationships. That shifting is changing completely the concept of development. And the concept of development did not change when sustainable development was defined. The shift didn't happen then. You know, if you go back to sustainable development, to the definition, you can see that it's still very much about the same concept of development. And of course, most of the world is asking for human development for obvious reasons, you know, but that means we have to reinvent what we call development and what we call well-being, because there is no way that we can all of us converge into the high, very high footprint of the development of modernity, you know, and we have to build with some elements which are already shifting: perceptions, needs, a sense of loss in many places by many people, allow people to be in a position to recognize they are lost. We are lost. We are in the process of crossing through the looking glass. So we are lost. Let's recognize that and let's start working from that. And just as when I say moving from the concept of development we had, I'm saying around since some time now, but now I notice that people are more getting it, that we cannot say the countries, the so-called developed countries are developed. Because if you look at the scheme that our friends and colleagues from Global Footprint Network developed on the map of Human Development Index versus ecological footprint, you will see that all developed countries are very far from the area of sustainable development, very far. And the countries which are closer to that in terms of both high level of human development and low level of ecological footprint are countries you wouldn't expect to put in a list of necessarily because you don't have them in mind. Those are countries, and I'm not saying they are perfect, but that's interesting that what you see there is countries like Jamaica, Cuba, Ecuador, the Philippines, Sri Lanka. Oh, might be there is something to learn. So let's profit from the shift in perception that the COVID has accelerated, and let's profit from the shift, huge shift in geopolitics. Because power is the ability not to have to learn anything until of course, your power becomes fragile. And then you have to learn again.
Thank you, Carlos. Oh.
No, that's okay.
Okay, I think we need to get some of these other people in the discussion. Particularly, I'd like Dr. Tom Powers to discuss about these blind spots. One of the important things you said, Carlos, was about the blind spots we have, and that we have to have a shift in epistemology, but we don't know if we're looking into our own blind spots or not, and that we're not caring for what counts, and those are in some of the blind spots. So Dr. Powers, would you like to comment on these blind spots?
Delighted, Anitra. Thank you. I'm so fascinated with all of the input so far, and I have so many thoughts, but let me just try to focus down. First of all, I think blind spots, first of all, back to the looking glass. Well, in defense of Carlos, I want to tell you, I have a son who is an engineer, and he's a very good one. He's an environmental engineer, and he is absolutely totally immersed in trying to rebuild parts of California that have been devastated either through human actions or environmental disasters that we've had too many of. But anyway, so he's a very good fellow, and I think Ryan knows him. He was on the trip to Haiti some years ago. But also in the looking glass metaphor, I think before, aside from which side you want to place yourself on, if you look in the looking glass, you cannot, I hope, avoid seeing, regardless of your blind spots, the image there, which is, well, first of all, I love history, and I've read history, and I've studied history. But now, I don't have to pick up a book. All I have to do is go and look in the mirror, and there's history. So we have this collective experience of our own. I mean, if you look at the panel today, there's at least 1,000 years of experience. Now, if we spun that backwards, it would take us right back to the Dark Ages, about the time some of my ancestors were coming over from Normandy to invade the British Isles. But what we have is all of this experience, which is knowledge. And how do we spin that into wisdom? That's my question and my dilemma, because we have a surfeit of, modernism, experience, material. How do we distill that into what we really need, which is precious, which is knowledge, which will guide us into a future that is survivable? And I think, whether or not you say that we have a dying planet, I think you'd have to say that it's critically ill. And I say that, from not only a medical perspective, but, a human perspective. And we really, it's an urgent problem, and we need to do something about it. So I say, yes, we do have to use the looking glass and see what's there, which is ourselves. And there is the answer. We can collectively, and each one of us in a part individually, we can come up with what I think will get us to survival, and not only to survival, but a reasonable and decent survival. And we're going to have to deal with things like measurement. I mean, look at the history of the last century. It was about boundaries and about where you belong, about homelessness, about migrations, about displaced people. That led to all kinds of mayhem, and we still have not solved those problems. So we have a lot of work to do, and I appreciate the opportunity to hear all of you. And I try to do the little bit I can here in California, working with physicians, we're working on wellness and maintaining the supply of healthcare people, because it has been up to now. I think the tide is turning with the availability of vaccines, but it has been an onslaught. People getting out of medicine because it's just too difficult. So anyway, I want to thank you, and I don't know what more to say, except I would, by whatever means and source, like to know how we can, in fact, spin the lead of knowledge and human experience into the gold of wisdom.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much.
Where
Before you start responding, Carlos, I'd just like to say that I think Julia and Gerald and Gabriella and Van might want to talk about other value systems which can be put to bear on the planet. And then we'll get to Bill Reese, who has a series of questions. So Carlos, can you make a quick response to Tom, so we can get on with these alternate value systems?
I mean, yes, just a quick one. Yes, it's crucial to convert knowledge into wisdom. Where is the knowledge we lost in information? Where is the wisdom we lost in knowledge? I'm not saying this. T.S. Eliot did more than a century ago. So not an obvious issue, but actually we know a lot about how to do that. So I think we are in a way, and this reminds me of the Black consciousness movement. The strongest mechanism of the oppression is to think that there is no other option, that there is no way to get out of our mental framework. And the line between oppression and liberation is not a line between some people and others. It's a line which goes across everybody's mind. We have the knowledge, we have the instruments. Some of our colleagues in the Club of Rome are working on that. We need more resources to make this happen in more places and make the processes grow. And last but not least, you are right, the planet is ill, but let's be clear, the bacteria will survive us. So it's not life as such which is at risk. It's mainly ourselves.
Thank you. Julia, would you like to discuss what he said about other cultures and other relationships and looking at things from different lenses? Because I think that will lead us into your talk, which is in April.
Thank you, Anitra, and thank you so much, Carlos. And I've been really paying attention to the comments and the questions, because that's what really piques my interest in how I want to frame what I'll be offering next. Because I think it's really in the spirit of building on this collective wisdom that, as Tom was saying, is in the room by virtue of all of our experience. So one of the things I'm really picking up on is how do we work within the paradigm to shift the paradigm? And here I think is, in response to your question and invitation, Anitra, here is where bringing in different ways of knowing and understanding from different cultures is very important, because they are in the paradigm, but they may not be having much room to move within the paradigm at the moment. And one way that I'll try to tap into a little bit when I speak about Bhutan is that their paradigm is very much the idea that well-being is a balancing of material and spiritual development. The leaders would say that from the very beginning. And they would say, of course, material development is important, and you can measure that according to a lot of things. Nobody would argue that we don't need roofs over our heads, foods in our bellies, and schools that work. But that's only half the equation. And then there's this whole aspect of the intangible, which is often not measured. And here respond to Didi's very salient question, how do we measure what counts? They would measure relationship, community vitality, cultural diversity. Do you know the traditional practices in your village? These kinds of questions, they would measure them to bring them into visibility. And then they would have them engage with each other so it becomes alive. This is the element of warm data that I so appreciated from Nora's presentation. It's not data sitting in a table that's then printed and disseminated to policymakers. It's engaged with. What does it mean? Why is it that women are less happy than men in Bhutan? Why is it that for the first time, young people are reporting being less happy than other age groups? It should provoke an engagement with the data that then alerts policymakers to what needs to happen next. So I'm holding these as questions, and I'm really appreciating the input, because I think it's the richness of engaging this kind of measurement systems, materiality worldview with the more subtle, hidden, and richly diverse world values coming together, that I think some of the clues are for coming out, transforming the paradigm from within the paradigm. So very helpful for my thinking. Thank you.
So Van, would you like to discuss briefly the integration of your Buddhism and so forth into these questions that Carlos has asked?
I'll take a slightly different dimension, Carlos. I really enjoyed your apple and apple tree analogy, and it reminded me much of the story that Thich Nhat Hanh, the Zen Buddhist master, tells very often. It's a story about he's looking at a letter, holding it in his hands, reading it, and says, if you look deeply into this letter, you'll see the paper that is written on. If you look even deeper, you can see the tree that the paper came from. And then still there's the soil, the water, the sunshine, the air that enable the tree to grow. And if you continue to look deeper, you can see the logger who cut the tree down. And if you look even deeper, you can see the logger's grandmother. But that depth of understanding and integration is offered not just by Buddhism, many of the indigenous cultures have equivalent things. Often if you find spiritual people from vastly different backgrounds, if you get them to talk directly about experience and drop a lot of the jargon that everybody uses, you find that there's pretty much talking about the same things. It's just amazing if you can get into that point. So, thanks for enriching our thinking experience, and very delightful. Carlos, thank you so much.
Now I'd like very much to hear from two of our educators about these needs and vision for the disempowered, especially the education of the disempowered. Marilyn, would you like to talk about your Afghan women's school?
Thank you, Anita. I've been listening to this and thinking about the paradigm, looking at the paradigm of change and where does that begin. And in Afghanistan, and I'll be talking about this tomorrow at K-Corps, we are working with young girls, and we have begun working with them on their self-esteem, how they view themselves within the culture and out of the culture. And it's been a really incredible process, because in many ways it's like a rebirthing, similar to what John has talked about. It's taking a leap into a new world that is present inside them, but has just been being born again. And as we've sort of traversed some of the challenges, like they can't communicate through cell phones easily because their parents don't consider it culturally appropriate for girls to have cell phones. We've discovered a way to help them to find their inner self and to explore in the middle of a very challenging situation, their hopes and dreams. And what we found is that when we touch on who am I as I look deeper into myself, go into the looking glass, there really is more there for me than I had thought. Sometimes all it takes is a helping hand to just reach out and ignite what is already a spark inside them, or is a spark inside of each of us. And it's been amazing to see what's been coming forward, not only for the girls, but for their mothers as well. So as we touch a child, and as John said, they're much more open and malleable, we have a chance to touch and spark that in a parent or an older person.
John Gilmore, would you like to address this question of the needs and views of the disempowered from the point of view of your LEAP school? I think you're muted, yeah.
It's interesting that just what Marilyn just said triggered for me the strange reality that in the LEAP school context, these children are making the transition from one paradigm to another while living in the most difficult economic situations. So they understand that they can understand the paradigm shift in anticipation. And that's the consciousness of Viktor Frankl. When he was in a concentration camp, he could say, this is important for me to love today because tomorrow will come and I will need to love again tomorrow, and make that consciousness transition. So I think the irony is probably that people who stuck in the very complex economic and social complexity are more heightened in their desire to move out of that. So the intent is easier to work with. Our difficulty is, how do you shift the intent of the complacent? It's easier to shift the intent of the angry. And if you go back to the Black consciousness movement in this country, the intent was aligned. The alignment of intent was aligned through the anger of young people who then could find a way of articulating that. That actually became, we are together in this and we're okay as we are. So I think there is a lot of learning to be taken from some of these movements in history, and then be very conscious that our biggest challenge will always be the complacent. Now, to go back just quickly to where to start, when you're doing this paradigm shift and you're operating bimodally, you start in the periphery actually, but you can't stay in the periphery. With your aligned intent, you move towards the center, and the periphery is the new paradigm can replace the core, which is the old paradigm, which then shifts to the periphery. And that requires patience and consciousness over and over again, and the pain of many years of battling with this transition, as Mampela can attest to with the Black consciousness movement. Here we are still in 2021, battling with this notion of internalized oppression.
Thank you, John, very much. I'd like to get to the question that Carlos asked. Why do we not learn what we already know? And nobody in the discussant room knows more than John Richardson, who worked with the first 4 of the modelers. He worked closely with Dana Meadows on a series of comparing different models. And he also worked on with Jerry Barney on USA 2000, and he worked with Masarovich and of course Barry Hughes for years in Cleveland. John, are you with us? Can you unmute yourself?
Anita, can I interrupt you, Anita?
Yes.
I think
Yes.
William Rees has been raising his hand for a very long time.
Yes, he's going to be right after John Richardson.
Okay.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes, yes, yes. John,
So I've been listening and learning from this group. I haven't worked so closely with many of you. And what has come to me in the different places I've lived is I think about, for example, the typical Singaporean who gets up in the morning as I do and may sit in front of his television and watch the morning news before going out and engaging whatever he is engaging with. And also the Singaporean family who go out and on a Sunday morning, they buy their copy of the Straits Times. And then they go back to their comfortable home and maybe they have stopped at a hawker's stand to pick breakfast because a lot of the meals are purchased from hawker stands, or maybe they're even sitting there. And I asked myself, what are the messages that these very average people over a whole spectrum, middle class people are getting every day? And they are not they are not the, by and large, the messages about what constitutes the good life and happiness that we're talking about. So for example, one weekend, I went through the entire issue of the Sunday paper and I collected every message and then classified them. And if you were guided by that, you would think that the route to happiness is buying things. Now, there were a very small number of messages of the messages that we're hearing today, but minuscule across the spectrum. So it was like the limits to growth or groping in the dark or other things had never been written. So I think there's a real challenge of consciousness raising relative to the messages that we're discussing and the messages that people spend most of their time listening to every morning in front of their television set and every Sunday as they're leafing through the Sunday paper or going out and taking a walk on Orchard Road or whatever they may be doing, or Fifth Avenue, or even Takajamshid in Iran. And the question is, and my model has always been the extension bulletin. So, I mean, how can we change write extension bulletins using agricultural extension as a metaphor to get our messages communicated more clearly and more widely in the language that people are mostly absorbing every morning in front of their television set, and I'm talking about average middle class and upper class people in front of their television set or from their Sunday newspaper or the equivalent. So that's what I'm grappling with.
thank you, John. Now, Bill Reese, I know you've been waiting and waving your hand at me. Please. Bill, unmute yourself.
Okay, yeah, fine. Yeah, I didn't mean to appear impatient. It's just that there's been so many interesting insights that I felt almost immediately I had to try to tie some of these things together. So thank you all for a very, very stimulating conversation. I want to revert to my roots as an evolutionary biologist to try to put some framing around what we've been talking about. And the first thing I want to comment on is just the evolution of the human brain, which has taken place over several hundred thousands of years, but in a sequence. So that we have really three major brain components: a brain stem, which is the source of many of our instinctive behaviors. There's a limbic system, which is the source of most of our emotional life. And most recently, we've evolved in the last 50 or 100,000 years, the cerebral cortex, at least the very large cerebral cortex of humankind. Now, all of us in this discussion, and people we mostly associate with, live mostly out of their cerebral cortex. We tend to act as if the world were a rational place. And the first point I want to make is that the brain is an integration, and that most of our decisions are actually as much influenced by our instinctive and emotional life as it is by our intellectual life. Now, different people differ in different ways, but the main point I want to make is that humans are not primarily rational. Most of politics, for example, most of economics is driven more by emotional instinct than it is by reason, and we can discuss that at great length. The second point I want to make goes right back to the beginning of what Carlos was talking about. And he argued that perception is not reality. Human beings don't experience reality. We only experience our perceptions of reality. But it's much more profound than that. Human beings socially construct realities, which then become shared within the tribe or the culture or the group. And those shared constructs, and I really must emphasize here that they are constructions which may or may not replicate or map accurately to the biophysical reality, for example, within which the society is embedded. Now, they are social constructs, they are not reality, but people act out of them as if they were reality. So for all intents and purposes, our perceptions are reality. And if there is a mismap between how we perceive the external world, even the external social world, and the way it really is, then we have a big problem. So there's a third element here, and that is that a social construct, which is part of the fabric of a culture, we call the social narrative or the cultural narrative. The cultural narrative consists of a set of overlapping narratives that are repeated over and over and over again in the course of an individual's growth and development. And they literally, and this now goes to cognitive neuroscience, they literally help to shape the cerebral circuitry, the synaptic circuits of the brain and the way people think. To see the profoundly important impact of this, it means that people literally acquire a physical presence in their brain of the social constructs from which we all act much of the time. This is not only the source of a great deal of social cohesion, but it's a source of individual identity. Because once you associate yourself with a fully embedded set of cognitive neural circuits, you identify with the thought processes involved in that. And because you share it with a group, it creates social cohesion. So this capacity of the human brain to acquire a physical presence of its perceptions is highly adaptive, at least in pre-industrial times. Okay. It's also the source of denial, because once a certain pattern of thought or thinking becomes embedded, then we tend to seek out people or circumstances that reinforce our pre-existing neural circuitry. And then we deny or we forget or we disregard any contrary information. So one of the reasons why people acquire a resistance to real knowledge, to the information that is coming down the pipe about the state of the world, is because it confronts profoundly their preconceived notions, that the cultural paradigm of perpetual growth, of increasing material well-being based on advancing technology and so on and so forth. That is our cultural paradigm. It's one that is now spreading globally and resists mightily the intervention of new knowledge, which says, hold it, that paradigm is completely at odds with the limitations of the biophysical reality within which we find ourselves. So that's really the gist of what I've got to say. But if you think about it, there's part of this that explains much of what each of you has said. For example, John Gilmore's young people who are so open to newness. It's because they do not yet have inscribed within their neural circuitry and their understanding of the nature of reality any preconceived notions. But they're willing to receive them, and they will be inscribed. I guess I do have one final point. Once one acquires a culturally ordained way of being, it's extremely difficult to break from it. It takes a great shock in order to break from it. So going back to something Carlos says, the pandemic has been a kind of shock of that kind. It's opened us up to new possibilities. And the way we responded to that pandemic shows that it may be responsible to respond similarly to the ecological crisis. But we have a lot to get over here, particularly since most of our actions originate beneath consciousness and don't come to the fore as openly as we might think.
Thank you, Bill, for all those thoughts. Now, Ted Manning is going to sum up all these things that Carlos and all of the discussants have added to our concept from David Corden. Ted? You're muted, Ted. Ted, you're muted. Ted, you're muted.
Yeah, it works better when I'm muted, actually. I'm better at it. Yeah, I guess my job is to try and accumulate all this collected knowledge and put it in one place, which of course is not going to happen. However, I don't think any of us could have sat through this without being stimulated in about a dozen directions at the same time. And I actually like what Bill just said. By and large, Newton's laws pertain. You know, things keep going in the same direction no matter what. You're never going to stop. You're never going to change. I think we've been very, very good at identifying the barriers to us being able to facilitate a sea change, and one which is really necessary if we are to achieve a broader global goal. I also very much appreciate the comments to one I threw in on you got to start local. Indeed, he said very clearly, how are you going to scale this up? And that is a massive issue because all of the success stories that each of you has been bringing, and I think Julie is going to bring us a good one next time, are local or relatively local, relatively limited. When I work with small island developing states, you actually get to talk to the prime minister, you get down and walk along the beach with the fishermen, you get to talk to the school teachers, and you have a drink with the policemen, and you actually get a pretty good handle of what they really want. The moment you get a little bit bigger, even in a modest sized country or a state in Canada or the United States, province in Canada, state in the United States, it's too darn big. You can't talk to everybody. You have very little social cohesion. They're busy. You're going to get opposition to almost anything you do. So I'll throw another challenge out, which is we got all these little success stories that I think we all know about. How are we going to find the ones that work and build on them and make them work? The other issue that I see is we must continue to exchange ideas because, as I put in one of the notes, we ain't there yet. We have defined the problems. In fact, we've been doing that for how many years our organization has been in business? And we've been very good at defining the problems and really looking forward towards the emerging problems. We have been somewhat less successful in defining what really works and what solves things. And to some extent, the charge to this group over the next few meetings and months is to focus a little more on that. We're going to mark ourselves on that, I guess, perhaps. Anyway, that is my summary. I notice one or two of you have not had a chance to speak. Is there anybody who really needs to?
David needs to speak to this mad tea party.
Rob Hoffman was allowed to speak either if he's there.
That's right. Rob, do you have something, final thing?
Otherwise, I am wrapping it up and saying, let's do this again because it's fun. And with luck, we can actually make a difference.
David can act as the Pope to the Mad Tea Party participants and give us all your blessing. But we're
Yeah.
running out of time. But Rob Hoffman, do you want to tell us something?
Oh, I just say a quick word, I guess. Building somewhat on Bill's comments, it strikes me that our human brain has evolved in such a way that we're very good at analysis. We can understand cause-effect chains that are local in space and time, but we're very bad at synthesis, at understanding systems that have unintended consequences that feed back on us. And it seems to me that we have not exploited the use of technology to help us understand complex systems. And I'll leave that
Thank
leave it
you.
there.
Now we need David's blessing as the head of the table at the Mad Tea Party.
Thank you, Anitra.
Put better stuff in the tea.
Just wanted to comment on my sense of what an extraordinary conversation this has been. To me, the nature of the Club of Rome is to get together leading thinkers from around the world. We could probably do better with our diversity than we have here, but the key is in this conversation, I heard people listening to each other and building on each other in a way that is all too rare in human conversations overall, including in the Club of Rome. And, you know, clearly we are at a moment of emergency that we have to address as an opportunity for the emergence of a new civilization grounded in a wholly different mental human frame of who we are and what our possibilities are. And this conversation we've just had, I think, exemplifies it. I think there is a growing readiness. It is my one source of hope for the future. A growing readiness in many circles for this kind of conversation. And so I just want to celebrate that and thank you all and make sure that we all recognize what in fact we're doing here. So I don't know.
Can I make one other comment? Marilyn is going to be making a presentation on her work around the world and in Afghanistan tomorrow on KCOR's presentation about the same time of day tomorrow. So just give her a little heads up. If you want to follow some of this further, she will be on tomorrow on the KCOR website.
If anybody wants an invitation, we're happy to send it to them.
Yeah.
And thank you all. And Julia Kim will be the most fascinating speaker next in April. So look for the announcement, I guess in your spam. I'll try to send you each an individual announcement. So celebration.
We'll be sorting out exactly when with her later in the week and get it back to you with the invitation to a similar Zoom presentation about a month from now.
Celebrate.
Yeah.
Thank you all. And
Thank you all.
Carlos.
Lovely to meet you.
Carlos,
Have a nice day.
you stimulated us tremendously. And we're very, very grateful to you, Carlos, for an excellent presentation. Thank you.
Happy to have done that.
Bye now.
Thank you to all of you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hasta la próxima.
Bye.